Þökkum Katrínu Olgu Jóhannesdóttur, formanni ráðsins kærlega fyrir. Líkt og Katrín kom inn á, að þá eru tímarnir að breytast örar nú en nokkru sinni fyrr og því ofarlega í huga okkar á þessum tímamótum sú spurning hvað framtíðin mun í raun og veru bera í skauti sér. Hingað því mættur einstaklingur sem ætlar að skyggnast með okkur inn í framtíðina, en þetta engin annar en Dominic Barton, forstjóri eins fremsta ráðgjafafyrirtækis heims, McKinsey Company. Margir kannast við fyrirtæki, sérstaklega í tengslum við hina títtnefndu McKinsey skýrslu sem víða hefur verið höfð að leiðarljósi hér á landi eftir bankahrunið. Á þeim 8 árum sem Dominic Barton hefur stýrt fyrirtækinu hefur hann orðið heimstakt nafn í alþjóðlegu viðskiptaumhverfi, auk þess að vera reglulegur gestur á listum yfir vinsælustu forstjóra heims meðal sinna starfsmanna. Þá Dominic sjálfur einnig helsti efnahagsráðgjafi kanadísku ríkisstjórnarinnar, enda Kanadamaður sjálfur. Dominic ætlar að fara yfir með okkur hvað felist í forystu á tímum 4. iðnbyltingarinnar. I want to welcome Dominic Barton to the stage. Go ahead.
Well, good morning. It's wonderful to be here in Iceland. This is my second time. The first time I was only here for a day, so I didn't get to see very much, but I could feel a fighting spirit, even in that one day. And I had a wonderful interpreter giving me some of the stories that are being said in the history and on leadership. But I really am delighted to be here because when I look at Iceland, to me, you're an example of a place that when you have ambition and drive and courage, you can make anything happen. And when I see what you've done since the financial crisis, where this country has come from, it's truly amazing. And there are many countries with many resources that are much more physically connected to other parts of the world that have not done what you've done. And what I want to talk about for the next sort of 30 or 40 minutes is some of the changes that at least we see coming on the horizon over the next 20 years. And what I would say is I think they're going to be some of the most exciting times in history. When I first began talking about these global forces about 7 or 8 years ago, I used to say it's probably some of the biggest changes in 30 years. And then as I've got older, the time frames expanded. And now I'm not sure I have the right historical perspective, but I'm in the view now of it's at least in the 500-year time frame, just because of the scale of the change and the speed of the change. But what's going to really matter, in my view, in this is going to be leadership and talent, like you. Just seeing young people that have the courage and the drive to do things. The world's your oyster. It doesn't matter where you are and where it is. So with that, I want to just give you a bit of an overview. And I'm going to talk, first of all, about four forces in particular. The first is that there is a huge economic power shift that we're in the very middle of, a power shift from the west to the east. That's one. And that has very significant implications for all organizations, particularly Western organizations, who are not moving fast enough to capture it. And I include McKinsey in that. We talk about it, but we don't move as fast as we should when we see it. The second is technology, and I probably don't need to spend much time talking about that. We all know it. But the speed and scale of the technological changes that are underway are transforming everyone into a technology company. We're all technology companies, whether we like it or not, as we move ahead. The third big force that's out there is we're becoming a very old Earth, except for a few countries and regions like India, Indonesia, and primarily Africa, the vast majority of the world is getting old. And as I get older, I think that's not a bad thing. It's good to have wise people. But you know, older people, at least in the traditional sense of the terms, are a little less productive. They cost more money than younger people in the system. And we're going to have to think about the implications of that. I think there's all sorts of new business opportunities and service opportunities, but it is a very significant transformation in and of itself. And then the fourth, which is really a bit of a combination of the three, is there's I think a search or yearning for a new societal deal. People are unhappy with how the system is working today. And we see that obviously reflected, I think, in the Brexit vote in the UK, with Donald Trump's election, with increasing populism. People are angry. They're not feeling that their leaders or the systems that are in place are doing the job that they need to be. We call it now, in McKinsey, it's kind of the great disequilibrium. We're in a disequilibrium. And the problem with that is that there's no one group or person, for sure, who can help fix that. So we're all assuming someone's going to do it, and it's not being done. And so this means that business leaders have to step up and take a much broader role. It means that government leaders need to step up and play a broader role. It means that social organizations need to step up and play a broader role, an educational institute. We all are going to have to do something different, because if we don't, we're going to find ourselves in I think, a very poor situation. I'm an optimist, so I'm excited, but it's going to require a lot of leadership, and that's what I'm going to sort of end with as I go through this. So let me just talk a little bit about the first force. And one of the ways to show it is if you were to sort of take the Earth and put it on a flat piece of paper and then try and balance it on where the GDP is, right? What you would have found in the year zero, it would have been somewhere near Afghanistan, okay? Because Asia, particularly China and India, was where the economic power was. There's 5,000 years of history we need to remember here. And for most of those 5,000 years, it was actually the East where we had the significant economic power. And basically over a 2,000-year period, we actually moved towards Iceland. In 1950, this was the center. You had the US, which was really rapidly moving, South America, that's where we were. But it took about 2,000 years to move there. And what's happening now with what's going on in China, in India, in Indonesia, and now Africa, is there is significant economic growth that's shifting. And what's happening is basically in a sort of a 75-year period, we're going to go back to where we were 2,000 years ago. That's a very significant shift if you think about, again, the speed and the scale. And just to put a little more numbers behind that, and this is what makes me very optimistic about the world in terms of growth, we are going to see 2.4 billion new middle-class consumers that are going to come into the system over the next 15 to 20 years. That's 1,000 times bigger than the Industrial Revolution, right? And again, the speed with which that's happening is significant. And that represents opportunities, because in this world, I would argue, you don't have to be proximate or close to where those consumers are to be able to participate in what they're doing. But you sure better know who they are or have some familiarity with them. And one of the things I'm going to say at the end, I think it's incumbent on all of us that come from smaller countries in the world. I come from Canada. I come from a farming town in British Columbia, which had 2,000 people in it, right? For me, when I was growing up, a very big trip for our family was a once-a-year trip to Vancouver. We used to think that was a big deal. We planned this trip. Well, you need to be thinking about your connections to the rest of the world, and there is no reason that any of us that come from small communities cannot be connected. And we're going to have to be, because that's where the consuming class is going to be and where a lot of the demand is going to be. That, just to give you an example of what this means, those 2.4 billion people, if you think about what they want to consume, we believe that there will need to be 75 Unilevers will have to be created between now and 2030 just to be able to serve those organizations. So 75 Unilevers, right, in terms of the scale. That's the opportunity. And there's no reason that those companies have to come from the established markets or from these markets. It's about entrepreneurship as we move through it. One of the biggest drivers of this growth is actually urbanization. China's urbanization has been one of the most significant forces for why you're seeing GDP growth. And China's only 55% urbanized today, so it's nowhere near done. Now that's why I'm actually quite bullish on China. You hear lots of stories. Will China's growth rate be 6.5%? Will it be 4%? Will it be 5%? I'm very bullish. I don't think it'll be an exact line, but the number of people that are moving from rural areas to city every year, irrespective of financial crises, of SARS, H1N1, they're moving. It's like gravity. And that creates economic growth as we move through it. And that's happening in Indonesia, in Bangladesh, and Africa as we look ahead. We're going to see, again, cities. This is another way to look at it. Cities actually matter. And this is, again, I think, an interesting advantage for when you think about Iceland. You know, I've never now think about China as one country. I think about it as 22 clusters of cities, because the behaviors of the consumers, even some of the regulations, are quite different as you go through it. But what's happening to these cities is pretty extraordinary. This is a picture that was taken of Pudong in Shanghai. I don't know how many people here have been to Shanghai. I'd just love to get a sense. How many people have? Oh, that's good. People travel, which is great in this system. So that's Pudong, and you actually over on the far left corner there are growing onions and beans, and that's what it looks like today, right? As you go through it. So there's about 200 of these cities that are moving in that way across Asia, where they want to again consume and operate like middle class in other parts of the world. We're going to see a significant portion of the most significant companies in the world being in this part of the world. And then I do want to mention Africa, because we get fooled when we look at the map. You know, the Mercator representation makes Greenland look bigger than Africa when you look at a regular map. But actually, if you start thinking about what you can stuff into that continent, it's a pretty big place, right? 2.3 trillion, 4 trillion on the consumer side, and you're seeing again urbanization that's going on. I think that Africa gets a lot of bad press. I think again, if we look at the media too much, you'd be frightened to go anywhere in there. They're actually some of the most vibrant economies in the world, some of the highest growth rates in the economy in the world in the sub-Saharan Africa region. And what this means is we're going to have a massive need for infrastructure. This is one of the biggest opportunities that's out there. About $3.7 trillion a year is needed. And there are a lot of pension funds that want to invest in that infrastructure as we look ahead. The Belt Road Initiative is something that I think in the West we don't think about enough. I think it is an extraordinary initiative. It's basically going to be about 12 times the Marshall Plan, right, and where it is. And this isn't about China trying to take over these parts of the world. It's about linking up these economies, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, into the global economy. And it's going to require many different countries to be involved in doing it, because these countries don't just want to have Chinese investment or Chinese companies coming in. They want global companies that are in it. And as I said, those 2.4 billion people are going to have an impact in terms of the vehicles, the airplane fleets that are going to be built. Food. I'm a huge proponent of ag food. A lot of people think food is an old industry. You know, in the early 1900s, we were transitioning from agriculture to manufacturing. What I would say now is agriculture is coming back again, but it's high-tech agriculture. And you in Iceland have some very innovative players. I'm really looking forward to seeing a couple of them actually tomorrow in this sector where we move, because of the massive amount of demand that's going to be out there that we're going to need to fulfill. One of the things I just mentioned is if you think about China, just to bring it to real life, I was in a meeting which is called the Asia Business Council, and people were telling me that they have limits in grocery stores in Australia on how much baby infant formula can be bought, right? And this is, it says here, you're 4 units per customer, right? And what you have is actually Chinese families flying down to Australia to buy baby infant formula. It's the only duty-free I've seen in the world where there's not whiskey, but there's baby infant formula, right, as you go through it. And so if you're in the dairy industry, this is a very significant opportunity for people to participate in. This demand is going to put a lot of pressure on our resources, and one of the biggest issues that we worry about is water. We did some work with the World Bank looking at all the water basins, and we're very nervous about the excess demand versus supply of water and how we do it. Water, in a sense, is the new oil as we think about that. That's going to be an extremely important area. So that's one force, which I think in and of itself is changing most businesses. If you want to be a relevant business over the next 15 to 20 years, you're going to have to do a lot to keep up with those changes. But an even bigger change is technology. And what's driving the technology change, I think, are 3 things, and they're relentless. Again, they don't care about financial crises or if Donald Trump's elected or who, it doesn't matter. This research and innovation continues. And it's basically a combination of a massive increase in computing power. You know, the first iPhone had more power than NASA had to send a man to the moon in 1969, just on that first iPhone. That's how much processing power it had. And I've tried to update this. The iPhone X is 210 times faster than the first iPhone, right? So this power of computing continues to move. We're much more connected as humans than we ever have, and also as things. You know, we have so many people that are connected, and that's creating a huge amount of data, which allows us to be able to provide and get a lot more insight than we ever had. And these 3 forces are transforming every single sector, every single industry, every single organization, and we're early days. So these are just a few of the pages, the connected devices and the people that we see, the amount of data that we're collecting. At one point, it was every 2 years we were accumulating more than our previous 2,000 years, right? It's just massive amount. The problem is we only can use 5% of it. 95% is useless, but we're getting better at how we can use that. And I think this is going to have, for example, profound implications on healthcare, right? Cancer research and so forth. There are 13 forces. I'm going to just jump here. 13 forces of technology that we think we should look at. It's not just the mobile internet. It's, you know, energy storage. It's regenerative medicine. It's a whole range of changes. Cryptocurrencies. It's everything that's moving through. And this is what I said. Everyone is going to be disrupted by this. Larry Summers likes to say we're only in chapter 1 of a 100-chapter book in this. So we haven't seen anything yet. You know, people probably, I'm sure, have heard of Hyperloop. And I was very nervous. It became public knowledge. McKinsey's helping a team in the Middle East build a Hyperloop. I think it's between Abu Dhabi and Dubai. And I was trying to say, please don't put that in the newspaper because it sounds like science fiction, crazy BS. Do not talk about that. And then I saw one of the pods that's actually being built by Elon Musk in New York. And these things, they're built. And these things can go 700 miles an hour under the ground. So this is not science fiction. that we're talking about in terms of what people are doing and what that means. The mobile internet has, what I would say, has changed everything. And one of the areas of the world that we don't spend enough time thinking about is actually in Asia. Silicon Valley is an amazing place to go to, and we should all spend time there, but I would be spending a lot of my time in Shenzhen. That is where the data revolution is occurring, because we're talking about companies that are used to dealing with hundreds of millions of people and the data that they provide. This is just an example of how technology is being used even in industrial businesses. Jeff emailed when he decided that GE was going to shift from a hardware to a software company. What clicked the switch for him was they make locomotives, and they spend a lot of money on research on, you know, the wheels of a locomotive, the metal, the power input-output ratio. But what they discovered is that the efficiency of use of a locomotive is actually the most important factor, right, in the value of a locomotive. And it's this boring piece of information, and sorry, it's again in miles an hour, but the average speed of a locomotive in the US is about 22 miles an hour per day over a 24-hour period. That's how you sort of measure the asset usage. If you can increase the speed of a locomotive by 1 mile an hour, just to make it 23 over the course of a day, if you're a railway company like Burlington Northern, that's worth about $250 million. There's a huge amount of value in the use of the locomotive, not the makeup of the locomotive. And what Jeff emailed worried about is that some group of young punks like Uber were going to come in and own that business and capture the 250. So he's spending all the time doing the hard labor, building the locomotives, and there's people that don't own any of the assets that are going to capture that value. And that's when he said, this is happening faster than we think, and we need to move. So we need to think about that in all of our operations, and that's why this Internet of Things is a very big opportunity. As I said, agriculture is one of the fastest changing areas because of technology, one of the most exciting changes that's out there. Next generation medical innovation, we're going to see, I think, very significant changes on that side, which are going to create, I think, a lot more opportunities in healthcare, going to address a lot of cost issues, but also lead to some other profound issues. You know, there was one of the things I find interesting in the Silicon Valley is there are Sunday morning seminars that a number of the internet entrepreneurs hold, and I went to one. And you know what the topics were? The first topic was, how do we beat death? That literally, I was going, are you guys crazy? I mean, what are you? And they had people talking. And the second is, how do we read people's minds? Right? It was way out there on this. And when I think about this, you know, I think what a lot of people in the medical devices area would say is we're probably close to being able to get the human body to be able to function for 160 years. You know, I can replace my knees, the problem we have right now is the brain. You know, we can't, keeping the brain up to 160 is very, very difficult. It tends to deteriorate. But we've got on the physical side, we're already there. And this is, think about the implications. That was another seminar. What does family life mean if you live to 250? And again, I don't have jet lag or anything. I'm just saying we have to start imagining some crazy things out there about our views of where things are and where it is. And I said, I know there's a lot of students that are here. I just say, you know, your lifetime and what you do, I'm jealous of you, because it's going to be longer, and I think you're going to have many, many different careers. You're going to also have to do lifelong learning. Doesn't stop when you finish your degree. It'll continue, but I think will be exciting. One of the challenges of technology is it's creating a lot more value with far fewer people. Now, one of the things I would say about that, I'm going to come back to Iceland at the end, this is actually a very big advantage for you. I think about in Iceland being a force multiplier. You know, there are many things. You don't have to have 100 million people to be able to make a difference. You can have a very small number of people and make a massive difference. If you think about WhatsApp, which I think Google bought for about $20 billion, there were 19 people in that organization. 19 people, right? And so this is something that you don't have to own all the assets to be able to do it. And again, this is, when I went to university and learned economics, if I went and told my professor I don't need to own assets to have a business, I would have been thrown out of the room. And these people don't really care about those assumptions and where they are. And so I think challenging our orthodoxies is going to be very important. We're seeing a breakdown between industries. It used to be, you know, bankers spent time with the bankers, and telecom was a different area in retail. We're seeing a lot more of the cross-sector integration that's going on. And I think, again, we look at where's the digitization and the advanced industries. We're in the very early stages. Obviously, you know, the media, high-tech telecom is probably at the tip of the spear in some of the changes. But you'd be surprised that mining companies are some of the most advanced in thinking about digitizing what they do and automating what they do. So everyone has to think about this. One of my favorite books, at least in the last 6 months to read, is a book by Kevin Kelly. He was an editor of Wired magazine, and he talks about 12 technological forces that will shape our future. And I think, again, it is useful to try and not only read about this stuff, but also look at science fiction. I think, again, being a science fiction writer today is very difficult because of all of these changes that are going on. But thinking about how we think the world might evolve and what you do is a very important part of what we do. So that's the technology side. Is this speed okay? Tell me, I should go, okay, I'll go, yeah. So aging, I'm just gonna quickly go through that. Basically, this is for the world. We're gonna have a doubling of the people over the age of 65, right, as we go through it. I think we're gonna have 400 million people over the age of 80. We're going to have basically far more people over the age of 65 than under the age of 14, right? We're going to have to think about where you find talent, right, in doing things, where you find the markets, what this means. And this is going to have a big challenge on classical views of productivity growth, because one of the biggest drivers of productivity growth around the world, including the United States, is labor force participation. And one of the biggest bump ups in productivity in the US came in the late 1960s through the 70s because women entered the workforce. That was actually one of the biggest bump ups as we go through it. But for most of the G7, as you look at those countries, you're going to see a declining population, which means you're going to have a headwind on the productivity side, which means you're going to have to think very differently about how a country drives its productivity, and that's where the technology is going to matter a lot. As I mentioned, again, as older populations, there's many wonderful things about them. As I said, they cost a lot. You know, typically, 75% of healthcare costs in a human, and I hope it sounds like I'm treating humans like an asset or a brick. I don't mean that, but 75% of the cost is consumed in the last 3 years, because as we get older, we're more frail. To keep people moving, it costs more. And when you have a younger and a smaller younger population to support that, that's going to put huge burdens on government. And so we're going to have to reinvent how we think we do healthcare. It is just not possible to draw a straight line on this side and how we think about what we do on the healthcare side. There's lots of interesting new businesses to be created. These are everything from the technology. This one on the left is a spoon that can actually reduce, you're shaking, it actually the spoon stays stable. It's just in the sort of the mechanics of it. There's all sorts of dating sites for older people. Stitch is one of the more popular ones. But there's a lot of new businesses that will be created through that. So if we then go to the final sort of force, which in some ways is driven by these other three, but also is independent, it's a time of huge societal change. As I said, in my view, we're in a great disequilibrium. And it's driven by this displacement. One of the biggest fears I have is job displacement from technology. So places like India are counting on manufacturing and the traditional job creation engines to be able to help those people moving from the rural areas to the cities. But if you're automating a lot of what you're doing, they're not going to get the jobs that they have and not be able to come into the system. We're doing work right now for the government of Canada, and there are about 18 million jobs in Canada, and we are forecasting that over the next 15 years, 40% of those jobs can be automated, right? And the challenge is this is a big issue for the 40 to 50-year-olds, not the 25-year-olds. So if you think about the number of truck drivers in Canada and in the US, their average age is about 48 years old. There are automated trucks already driving in Utah. They're there, right? The regulations in place. What are we going to do with the 48-year-old truck driver? Are they going to learn code? I don't think that's going to work that way. And we better think about it, because you talk about 40% of a population that all of a sudden doesn't have a job. They're not going to be very happy. It's not going to be fair. And if we don't think about that now, we're going to have a big problem coming. The second is this rising inequality. We're seeing it everywhere around the world. As I mentioned, those 19 people at WhatsApp feel very good about what they're doing. But what you're seeing with technology is an increasing returns to talent like we've never seen before. And that's going to cause tension in any society, and it's worsening as we go through it. I think there is an increasing polarization that's going on, also I think partly driven by technology because of polarization. And I'll mention one. If in the United States in the 1990s, if you wanted to produce a television show on CBS or ABC, you needed to have about an audience of 6 million people to be able to make it work, which meant you had to be, by definition, more in the middle. You couldn't have an extremist TV show because you wouldn't get the audience. Well, today, because of the internet, because of the technology we can use to segment customers, all I need is 15,000 people. So I can find some pretty crazy people that I can develop programs for and just focus on them. And I'll watch my crazy show, and you'll watch your crazy show, but we won't share anymore and understand what's happening. And that's happening more and more as we go through the system. So these are some of the factors. There's geopolitical instability. I think whenever you have a rising power, this is what the Graham Allison book. He's a former dean of the Kennedy School, writing about really the rise of China and how will the U.S. and other established powers, if you will, deal with that? Because in most transitions, they don't go very well. That's our history, I think. The president can probably correct me on that as I go. But that's our history. And the question is, how are we going to be able to manage these transitions? And then we have, as Ian Bremner would say, we're in a G0 world, right? And we've got our friend Kim Jong-un, who's doing what he wants on that side of things. And what I worry about on that side is I'm not fearful of a planned attack. What I'm fearful of is a mistake. A U.S. destroyer by mistake runs over a North Korean fishing boat, and then boom, you set the thing off. And that's our history too. So these four factors are making the environment in which we're operating in quite an unstable place. And I don't see a multilateral organization that's working on this to fix it. There's no savior for us to try and fix it. We're all going to have to play a different role. And I'm going to skip ahead a bit here. I mentioned the automation. This is the this is today, right now, for 60% of the jobs, 30% of the activities can be automated. 20% of my job could be automated. It probably should be automated, my colleagues say. This is a picture actually of a truck driving in Utah. There actually is a person in the front seat, but he's not driving. He's actually looking at his iPad. Just to say, but there are Freightliner trucks that are moving. One of the most shocking things, and this was Oxfam that put this out, the wealthiest 62 individuals in the world have the same wealth as the bottom half of humanity. You know, that's not a stable situation, especially when people have the technology now to understand what it is and how people are living and how that works. And if you look at what's actually happened to the middle class in some of the sort of developed countries, again, looking at 5 European countries and the 2 North American countries, if you look back 1993 to 2005, only 2% of the households had flat or falling incomes. In the period 2005 to 2014, and granted we had a financial crisis, but we're now, I think, through that, you had 65 to 70% of people having falling or flat incomes, and that doesn't make people feel hopeful about where things are going to be. I think this means that everyone's going to have to change. As I said, business is going to have to do things differently. The idea that business is just focused on shareholder value is, I think, an old model. Business has to be thinking about its role with stakeholders, right? What are you doing, not just for your shareholder, but for your customer, for your employees, and do you have a license to operate, right, in the environment in which you're working? And if you don't think about that, you won't be around. And by the way, that's the old capitalism. You know, I look at this a lot because at McKinsey we're called a lot of bad names, and we typically deserve it, but one I like is we're known as the Jesuits of capitalism, right? So we have to fight for capitalism. So I've spent time looking at, if you look at Adam Smith and you look at his first book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, probably the most boring book I've ever read in my life. That's why, because it's not that popular. He has a phrase in there that is really important, and it says, it's the duty of the entrepreneur to take care of the society in which they operate. It's quite a socialist thing for Adam Smith to have said. We don't talk about that much now. But that's what we're going to have to think about, to have a license to operate, right, and where it is. So thinking about thinking about a broader set of metrics of what you measure, not just return on capital, earnings per share. You've got to be thinking about what is the resources that you're actually consuming, right? What are you doing for the health of the community in which you operate? And you can measure that and move it through. This is the polarization point I made. If you actually look in the U.S. at the differences between Republicans and Democrats as you move, you just see an increasingly wide shift that's going on. So we're becoming more desperate. And the implications of all this, all these changes, this is a page I keep on the back of my desk in New York, and it's basically the average lifetime of a company, a big company. And in 1935, which was not a great time to be on that list, the average lifetime was basically 90 years. And today, it's 15. So the clock speed, the churn of the market is faster than typically companies can look at. And I put this on my wall because McKinsey's 90 years old. So I worry, are we moving fast enough and challenging our orthodoxies to be able to have the right to be here? Because if you don't, you disappear. And I think from an interpretation of the speech you're making on leadership, I think this is where you have to have the courage to act, and you have to have the courage to challenge assumptions that you hold, orthodoxies you may have held for decades, may not be the ones you need to hold as you look ahead. Here's an example of change I just did in Formula One.
And now it's Bill Holland coming in on pits in car 3. Bill hails from Philly and is showing in second place and hoping to take the checkered flag here today. And the fuel goes in. Having a bit of trouble with that wheel nut. Everybody's standing by. The driver getting refreshment now. Also getting updates on the track surface.
The driver wants to get going.
This guy is super keen to get back out there on the track. And there he goes. All the guys are lined up, ready? And there it is. The quick tire change. The fuel goes in. Everything ready. And up it goes.
You see, even in motorsports, things are changing. But I think it's just it's a basic, to me, an analogy to what we all need to do in terms of how we drive it. Even in the basic way that we do things can be done faster, more efficiently, better. And that's what all of us are going to have to be able to do. And this is where it come to leadership, which is the final part of what I wanted to talk about. And I think one of the most important things is to talk about who leaders are as opposed to what leaders do. We spend a lot of time, and it's good, it's important, to talk about what it is leaders should focus on. You know, they need to be thinking long-term, they have to develop, they have to have a vision, they have to be good at managing the people. A lot of it's on how they spend their time, and that's all important. In my experience, I think the more important part is actually the character of the leader, who the leader is. And one of the things ever since I took this job about 9 years ago, I had a rule, which is I have to see 2 CEOs or leaders a day, because I didn't join McKinsey to do internal work. I get energy from being outside. And I always ask those leaders, typically they've been in their role for quite some time, what do they wish they knew now that they could have told their younger self as they were leading? What would have been? And inevitably, it's around character that you come down to it. And and this is again where I think when we think about this, you can train it. You're not born with your character. I think it's about what you do. And so I just want to pick a couple of them as we go through. One is just is ambition. And this is another picture that I keep behind my desk. It's a picture of the POSCO pit in Korea in 1969. And you've got President Park in the middle, TJ Park, who is a business person on the left, and a worker on the right. And I keep this on my wall because South Korea had a GDP per capita of about $300 a year, right? It was literally one of the poorest countries in the world, right? They had no energy, none. They had no natural resources, but this leader said, we're going to build a steel company. And the World Bank told them 5 times, you will not do that. That is a ridiculous idea. And if McKinsey was there, we would have told them 25 times. I would have lain across the pit saying, don't do it, right? And this is a picture of them about to blow up the ground to be able to make the pit. POSCO, the steel company, today is the world's most productive steel company in the world, by far. The R&D that's done, significant, and to me, this is a picture of raw ambition. Not crazy ambition, but bold ambition. I think the notion of being able to not only think about the first order consequence of something, but what sometimes people call the second bounce of the ball. What happens? Johnson & Johnson's an organization I admire a lot because they've been around for well over 100 years. They're a very high-performing organization, and it's because they change and challenge themselves on a continuous basis in what they do. Mary Barra, just someone who's able to make very tough decisions. She's one of my heroes because she came up through the human resources department. It's about talent and how you think about your talent and growing leaders in a traditional organization and where you move it. Randall Stevenson at AT&T, he's one of the most hardcore capitalists I've met, but also one of the most broad-minded. So he has put in place something that we're going to see more of in the world, which is, he said that 40% of my workforce will not be ready for the new digital world that we're moving into. And a typical CEO, hardcore capitalist, would fire the 40% and find the new one. What he did was develop a training program with Georgia Tech, an internet company called Udacity, and basically said to employees, if you want to take the courses part-time while you're working, and you get the medallions, and you can do them while you work, you don't have to leave the company to do it, you keep your job. If you don't, you're gone. And it cost them a lot of money, but it made the workforce much more committed, resilient, and I think innovative for what they need to do and where it is. And I think we're, as business, this to me is an example of a business leader taking care of the society in which they operate, not abandoning it for someone else to go and fix. And we're going to have a lot more of this type of leadership. Carlos Ghosn is one of the most longest-standing CEOs. I think it's now 14 years. And he tells me just about now it's how you manage your energy, not your time, because it's very difficult to manage your time. So it's about where's the source of where you get energy to be able to do something, and what is it that sucks energy from you, and how you balance that in what you do. And again, a person I admire a lot, Max Dupree, Herman Miller, a very high specialty furniture maker. I just think it's a wonderful line. You know, the first responsibility of a leader is to define reality, you know, which is telling the truth about where we are and what we need to do, which a lot of leaders don't like to do, because sometimes it's not very nice, but you need to lay it out. What's the reality? The last is to say thank you, which I think is interesting. And in between, you're basically a servant. You're there to help other people move. And this notion of selflessness is extremely important in leadership. If you look at the decision to make a 5-star general, the top general in the US military, and I went to watch how they do this, thinking it would take 2 days to figure it out. It was a 15-minute conversation. Because what they said is it's simple. We can look at the track record of what people do, but it comes down to two things: selflessness and judgment. That's what we, at the end of the day, are going to be looking for, right, and where it is. So this selflessness is extremely important. And one of my all-time heroes is the fellow on the left. He was the miner that basically led the group of 33 that were lost, trapped for many, many weeks in a mine, right, with very little food. You can imagine he wasn't a leader, he became a leader over those 33 days, right, when you're down there. Just think about the dynamics of what's going on. And this is again where, and you know, I've heard him speak. He's not an inspirational speaker. Everyone doesn't sort of wander around and go all this. You don't really notice him and where he is, but wow, what a leader, right? And what he did down there and how it works. And I think there's a lot of it again is around the characteristics. He didn't tick all the boxes. You know, he didn't have high GPA score in where he was and what he was doing. It was the character of what he did. And then Jack Ma, I love this one. You know, when KFC came to China, 24 people went for the job, 23 people were accepted. I was the only guy that wasn't, you know? Bet you KFC's regretting that. But just the notion of dealing with failure. I don't think we think enough about resilience. And some of the best leaders I've met have experienced a lot of failure. And I think you can't be a leader unless you take risk, which means you have failure. But to pick yourself back up is a difficult thing to do, and resilience is very important. So these are, again, some of the elements that I think are important as we think about the times of change that we're in. It's going to take an extraordinarily large amount of leadership. That leadership can come from anywhere. We don't have to have tens of millions of people. Very few people can jolt the earth in a very positive way. And with that, I'd want to thank you for listening for me for so long. I apologize for talking so long. But I hope you see the world as optimistically as I do. There's lots of challenges. And more importantly, I hope you step up and you play a big role in making this a really exciting, fun world, because it's out there for you to do it. Thank you very much.